Night settles heavily over the Pacific. The sea is black, flat, unreadable. Above it, the sky carries no moon. Inside a U.S. Navy warship deep below the deck, the Combat Information Center glows faint green. A radar scope sweeps in slow, mechanical arcs. Headphones press against tired ears. A pencil rests against a grease-coated plotting board. The operator watches the blips appear, small, uncertain echoes at the edge of detection. Japanese aircraft, coming in low, coming in silent. Night raiders trained to strike where eyes are useless, and guns react too late. Most men on the ship will never see the enemy tonight. They will sleep, stand watch, or wait at their stations, unaware of how close death is moving through the darkness above them. The radar returns again, then again. Two lines form on the plot, thin, deliberate marks that do not match the expected approach. The operator pauses. He measures time, bearing, speed. The pattern is wrong. Or rather, it is dangerously right. If the plot is correct, the bombs will fall where the ship was, not where it is about to be. And that difference, measured in seconds and pencil strokes, exists only because of what the war has already become. By the time American radar operators were tracing faint lines across plotting boards in the Pacific, the war had already taught a brutal lesson. Daylight belonged to air power. But night belonged to uncertainty. After Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the United States Navy entered a conflict defined by distance. Vast ocean spaces, scattered islands, fleets operating days from the nearest harbor. In these conditions, visibility was survival, and visibility vanished after sunset. The Imperial Japanese Navy understood this early. Long before radar became standard aboard American ships, Japanese doctrine emphasized night operations. Their aviators trained to navigate by stars and coastline silhouettes. Their crews practiced low-altitude approaches designed to evade lookouts and delay anti-aircraft fire until the last possible moment. In the opening months of the Pacific War, this advantage was deadly. American ships were hit at anchor, at sea, while maneuvering in formation. Bombs fell not because Japanese pilots were unseen, but because they were detected too late. At the heart of the problem was time. A ship at sea, even at full speed, could only move so far in a minute. A bomb released from altitude took seconds to fall. The difference between survival and destruction often came down to whether a captain had advance warning or merely a shouted alarm. Early in the war, that warning usually came from human eyes. Lookouts scanned the darkness with binoculars. Gunners watched the sky for engine flashes. These methods were imperfect even in clear weather. At night, they were nearly useless. Radar existed, but it was still new. In 1941 and early 1942, most U.S. Navy ships carried radar sets that were technically impressive and operationally misunderstood. Operators were often sailors trained in weeks, not years. Officers frequently distrusted the machines, preferring visual confirmation over abstract echoes on a screen. This skepticism cost lives. During night air attacks in the early Pacific campaigns, around Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands, and across the approaches to Australia, Japanese bombers repeatedly exploited gaps in American detection. Ships maneuvered too late. Formations remained predictable. Bombs fell where ships had been, not where they were going, but without warning, even that slight advantage meant nothing. By mid-1942, the U.S. Navy was adapting under fire. Lessons were written in after-action reports and casualty lists. Radar was no longer optional. It was essential, but radar alone was not enough. The machines could detect aircraft at distance, but raw data meant little without interpretation. A radar scope showed range and bearing, not intent. It did not explain whether an aircraft was approaching directly, crossing the formation, or positioning for a delayed release. That judgment still belonged to humans. And at night, under pressure, judgment was fragile. To solve this, the Navy began reorganizing how information flowed aboard ship. Instead of radar reports being shouted up ladders to the bridge, ships created centralized spaces where data could be processed, compared, and acted upon in real time. These spaces became known as Combat Information Centers, CICs. By late 1942 and into 1943, CICs were appearing aboard destroyers, cruisers, and aircraft carriers across the Pacific. They were dark rooms filled with radar scopes, plotting boards, voice circuits, and men whose job was to see what no one else could. Yet even inside these rooms, doctrine lagged behind reality. Radar plotting procedures were standardized on paper, but in practice, they often failed to capture how enemy pilots actually flew at night. Plots assumed straight-line approaches, constant speeds, predictable behavior, Japanese night raiders were neither straight nor predictable. They adjusted altitude, altered headings mid-approach, released bombs while turning away, counting on inertia and darkness to mask their escape. To counter this, something more than equipment was required. It demanded a way of thinking, simple, disciplined, and fast enough to matter before bombs were already falling. That way of thinking would emerge not from a design bureau or a manual, but from a single plotting board, a pencil, and two lines drawn at exactly the right moment. And to understand how that happened, the story must move inside the Combat Information Center itself. The Combat Information Center was not built for comfort, it was built for clarity. Buried deep within the hull of a warship, the CIC was shielded from blast and weather but also from daylight and horizon. There were no windows, no sense of motion. Only instruments, voices, and the steady rhythm of machines doing mathematics faster than the human eye. By 1943, most major U.S. Navy combatants operating in the Pacific carried some form of CIC. Destroyers, cruisers, and carriers all adapted the concept to their size and mission. At its core, the function was the same: collect information, process it, and turn it into decisions before the enemy could act. Radar was the heart of this system. Air search sets swept the sky, sending out pulses that returned as blips, abstract marks representing metal moving through space. Each sweep updated the picture every few seconds. To an untrained observer, the scope looked chaotic. To an experienced operator, it was a language. The problem was translation. Standard procedure required radar operators to call out bearings and ranges as contacts appeared. Plotters then transferred those numbers onto a large plotting board, marking positions at timed intervals. Over successive marks, a track emerged, an estimated course and speed of the approaching aircraft. In theory, this process created foresight. In practice, it often created delay. Each step introduced seconds of lag. A contact appeared, it was identified, data was relayed, the plot was updated. By the time a clear track formed, enemy aircraft were sometimes already close enough to release weapons. Japanese pilots understood this weakness intuitively. Night attack tactics emphasized ambiguity. Aircraft approached at angles that confused early plots. Some crossed formations instead of flying directly at them. Others feinted toward one ship, then adjusted course just before release. In darkness, these subtle changes were nearly invisible to lookouts and difficult to read on early radar displays. CIC doctrine assumed that plotting a single, continuous line was enough. But that assumption rested on a critical flaw. It treated enemy aircraft as if they behaved like predictable projectiles rather than thinking adversaries. Inside the CIC, this mismatch created tension. Radar operators were often young enlisted men, trained quickly and thrust into responsibility far exceeding their rank. Plotters worked under red lights, grease pencils in hand, trying to impose order on a fluid situation. Officers in the CIC or on the bridge relied on their assessments, yet often questioned conclusions that lacked visual confirmation. Trust had not yet caught up with necessity. It was in this environment that improvisation quietly began. Operators started looking not just at where a contact was, but how it moved between sweeps. A single line showed direction. Two lines drawn across successive time intervals showed intent. The two-line plot was not officially named in manuals at first. It emerged from experience. By drawing two short vector lines instead of one extended estimate, operators could compare changes in bearing and range more precisely. If the second line shifted in a way that suggested a crossing course rather than a direct approach, it revealed something critical. The aircraft was aiming not at the ship's current position, but at where it expected the ship to be. This distinction mattered. Ships under attack often maneuvered only after a warning was issued. A delayed turn meant a bomb released seconds later would still fall along the original predicted track. But if the CIC recognized a crossing approach early enough, the ship could alter course sooner, moving out of the calculated impact zone before the bomb ever left the aircraft. The brilliance of the method was its simplicity. It required no new equipment, no recalibration, only discipline, timing, and the confidence to trust what the plot was showing. On the night this story turns upon, one radar operator applied that discipline with uncommon precision. He did not raise his voice. He did not dramatize the threat. He drew two lines, watched how they separated, and realized the enemy had already chosen where to drop. The only question left was whether the warning would be believed, and whether there was still time to act. That question would be answered in minutes, as the radar scope filled with fast-closing echoes and the Pacific night pressed in around the ship. The first angle of this moment is human because radar did not think. People did. Inside the Combat Information Center, the radar operator stood watch in a state of constant tension. Night watches were long. Fatigue crept in silently, dulling reaction times and confidence. The glow of the scope became hypnotic if attention slipped even briefly. Every sweep mattered because any one of them could be the sweep that showed an incoming attack. The operator's task was deceptively simple: observe, measure, report. Yet behind that routine lay enormous responsibility. A misread bearing could send a ship turning the wrong way. A delayed report could erase the advantage radar promised. Unlike gunners, the operator would never see the results of his accuracy. His success was measured in nothing happening. This required discipline rather than adrenaline. Technologically, the radar itself imposed strict limits. Early air search sets had coarse resolution. Contacts blurred together at range. See, clutter and atmospheric conditions could distort returns. Altitude information was minimal or non-existent. Operators had to infer three-dimensional movement from two-dimensional data, using time as their only reliable depth cue. Every sweep updated the picture, but it also erased the last. Memory and plotting bridged the gap. That is where procedure entered the frame. Standard plotting methods assumed linearity. They worked well against aircraft flying steady courses at constant speed. Against Japanese night raiders, they often lagged reality. The two-line plot addressed this gap by reducing assumption. Instead of extending a single projected course, the operator plotted two discrete vectors, one from each timed position update. When those lines failed to align, the discrepancy revealed a maneuver. When they crossed a formation's projected path, they exposed the bomb release geometry. This method transformed raw radar returns into predictive insight. It also demanded confidence. The operator had to trust the plot even when it contradicted expectation. The CIC officer had to trust the operator. The bridge had to trust both, often without seeing or hearing the enemy. That trust was not guaranteed. The second angle is technological, but not in the sense of innovation. Nothing new was added to the ship that night. The radar was standard. The plotting board was standard. The grease pencil was standard. What changed was interpretation. Radar was often described as an extension of vision, but in reality it was closer to an abstraction of time. It showed where an aircraft had been seconds ago. The plot showed how those seconds related to movement. The two-line method compressed that relationship into something immediately readable under pressure. The final angle in this section is procedural. Naval doctrine evolves slowly, especially in war. Manuals are written for consistency, not improvisation. Yet combat forces adaptation whether doctrine approves or not. The two-line plot did not violate procedure. It refined it. It stripped away unnecessary projection and focused on immediate change. In doing so, it allowed a CIC team to move from reaction to anticipation. As radar contacts multiplied on the scope that night, the plotting board filled with marks. Some aligned, some did not. One pair of lines, drawn cleanly and spaced precisely, showed a crossing approach that standard plotting might have smoothed into a harmless arc. The operator saw it. The plot showed it. The enemy aircraft were not coming straight in, they were already aiming. And as the range ticks counted down and bearings tightened, the value of those two lines would be tested not in theory, but in the seconds before bombs fell. From the enemy's perspective, the night belonged to them. Japanese naval aviators trained extensively for low-light operations. By the middle years of the war, they understood American radar existed, but they did not fully grasp its limits or its potential. Their assumption was simple: radar might detect presence, but it could not reliably predict intention. Night attack doctrine reflected this belief. Aircraft approached from oblique angles, often crossing a task group's projected path rather than flying directly toward it. Pilots delayed bomb release until the final moments, sometimes releasing while already banking away. This tactic reduced exposure to anti-aircraft fire and exploited the lag between detection and maneuver. Against ships relying primarily on visual warning, it worked. But against a CIC interpreting radar with precision, it introduced a vulnerability of its own. Crossing approaches left signatures. Subtle shifts in bearing over successive sweeps revealed geometry. What looked like randomness to the eye formed patterns on a plotting board. That vulnerability could only be exploited if leadership trusted the data. This brings the angle of command into focus. On a U.S. warship, decisions during an air raid were compressed into moments. The officer of the deck balanced formation integrity, maneuvering limits, and the risk of collision. Altering course too early could disrupt screens. Too late and bombs would already be falling. Warnings from CIC had to be concise, confident, and timely. When the radar operator's plot indicated a crossing approach, the report did not describe fear or speculation. It stated geometry, bearing change, estimated release line. The language was clinical because the stakes were absolute. Leadership faced a choice: act on an abstract prediction or wait for confirmation that might never come in darkness. In earlier months of the war, many commanders hesitated. Radar had cried wolf before. False contacts, misplots, and nervous operators had all eroded trust. But by this point in the conflict, experience had reshaped priorities. Ships lost at night left no room for skepticism. The order to maneuver when it came was not dramatic, it was procedural. Rudder commands passed down, engines adjusted. The ship began to shift its track through the water, quietly, deliberately, without knowing if the enemy was already committed. The moral angle of this moment lies in responsibility without visibility. Most of the crew never knew they were targeted. They felt only the ships turn beneath their feet. No alarms screamed. No flares lit the sky. Safety came disguised as routine motion. The radar operator bore the weight of that invisibility. If the plot was wrong, the maneuver might place the ship directly under falling bombs. If the plot was right, nothing would happen, and no one would know why. This is the paradox of prevention in war. Success looks like absence. Failure looks like catastrophe. As the range closed, Japanese pilots executed what they believed was a perfect night approach. From their perspective, the ship remained where it should be. The release point had been calculated, the escape turn rehearsed. But below decks, two lines on a plotting board had already rewritten that calculation. The ship was no longer where the enemy expected it to be. The geometry of attack and defense had diverged, separated by minutes, discipline, and the willingness to act on an unseen warning. What remained was the moment of truth when bombs left aircraft racks and physics took over. That moment was seconds away. The radar scope tightened. Contacts that had once hovered at long range now advanced with unmistakable speed. Bearings changed by degrees instead of fractions. The sweep interval felt shorter, not because the machine accelerated, but because time itself seemed compressed inside the Combat Information Center. The operator marked the board again and again. The two lines did not converge, they crossed. That crossing was the moment of certainty. It meant the aircraft were not lining up on the ship's current position. They were setting up a release path, one calculated on where the ship would be if it continued straight ahead. The report moved fast: bearing, range, crossing angle. Estimated bomb release line offset from present course. The language was stripped of interpretation. It did not say might, it did not say possible, it stated what the geometry showed. In the CIC, the officer absorbed the plot in a glance. There was no time for debate. The distance remaining was measured in seconds, not miles. If the maneuver came after bomb release, it would change nothing. The call went to the bridge, orders followed immediately, rudder over, engines adjusted. The ship began to swing, just enough to matter, not enough to disrupt formation or signal panic. To the crew topside, the motion felt ordinary. To the enemy above, it was invisible. Japanese aircraft pressed in, flying the approach they had trained for. At night, they relied on dead reckoning and expectation. The ship below was assumed to be where it had been moments before. The release calculation accounted for speed, altitude, and fall time, but not for unseen deviation. Inside the CIC, the radar returns momentarily blurred as aircraft passed a beam. The plotter updated the board with shaking hands kept steady by habit. The operator watched the sweep past the predicted release point. No change in course from the attackers. That confirmed it. The enemy was committed. Bombs would fall along the original line. The ship was now outside it. Seconds later, reports came in rapid sequence. Aircraft passing overhead, engine noise fading. No explosions, no impacts. The silence was not immediate reassurance, it was a pause heavy with uncertainty. Then the radar scope cleared, contacts receded. The night sky, once crowded with threat, emptied as the sweep returned clean arcs. The ship continued its altered course for several long moments before easing back into formation. Only then did the magnitude of what had almost happened begin to register. Had the warning come later, the maneuver would have been useless. Had the plot been wrong, the turn might have placed the ship directly under falling bombs. There had been no margin for correction. Below decks, no one cheered. There was nothing to celebrate yet. Survival at sea did not announce itself with certainty. It revealed itself slowly, as minutes passed without damage reports, as the smell of smoke failed to appear as the ship remained whole. The radar operator made one final mark on the board, completing the sequence. Two lines, crossing vectors, a cleared scope. Above him, 800 sailors slept, worked, or stood watch, unaware that the difference between life and death that night had been measured in pencil strokes and trusted judgment. But the story was not finished. Bombs had missed, but understanding why they missed would shape what happened next, not just for this ship, but for every ship that learned from this moment. The absence of impact was the first confirmation. In naval combat, damage announces itself immediately. A bomb strike is unmistakable, shock through the hull, ruptured steel, cascading reports of fire and flooding. When none of those came, the silence itself became evidence. Minutes passed. The ship held its course, engines steady, crew still at action stations. Radar continued to sweep, not for reassurance but for return. Japanese night raiders sometimes circled back, adjusting tactics if the first pass failed. No one in the CIC assumed the danger was over. The scope remained clear. Only then did the tension begin to ease, though no one relaxed fully. The CIC officer ordered a review of the plot: bearings, ranges, timing. The two-line vectors were still there on the board, unambiguous even in hindsight. The crossing angle matched the predicted release geometry almost exactly. What had looked like a simple maneuver had been a precise escape. Above deck, lookouts reported nothing unusual: no flares, no near misses, no aircraft visible against the stars. To them, the night had passed uneventfully. That, paradoxically, was the measure of success. The Japanese pilots believed they had attacked correctly. From altitude, the ship's movement during the final seconds would have been imperceptible. Bombs released on calculated headings fell into empty water, their splash unseen in darkness. The physics were unforgiving. Gravity did not adjust for a target that was no longer there. As the threat receded, routine resumed with quiet efficiency. Action stations stood down in stages. Watches were reset, reports were written. The radar operator logged the contact sequence and plotting method in exact terms: times, bearings, ranges, maneuver angle. There was no embellishment. That restraint mattered. Naval lessons spread only when they could be verified, replicated, and trusted. This was not a story of luck. It was a demonstration of method. In the hours that followed, the significance of the event deepened. Nearby ships reported no damage. A coordinated attack that should have struck multiple vessels had failed completely. The common factor was not firepower or formation. It was early maneuver based on radar interpretation. 800 sailors lived through the night without knowing how close they had come to destruction. By dawn, the ocean looked unchanged. No debris, no oil slicks, no scars on the ship's hull. The only trace of the encounter existed on paper, in grease pencil marks that would soon be wiped clean for the next watch. Yet those marks carried weight. They showed that radar was not merely an early warning tool. Used correctly, it was a predictive weapon. It allowed ships to move before the enemy committed, to turn the attacker's assumptions against him. This realization did not arrive as revelation. It emerged as confirmation. A quiet understanding among those who had watched the plot unfold and trusted it when it mattered most. The night had proven something essential: technology alone does not save lives. Interpretation does. And with that proof secured, the consequences of this moment would ripple outward, into training, doctrine, and the way the Navy would fight in darkness for the rest of the war. Those consequences belong to what followed. In the hours after the attack, the most important reports were the ones that never came. No damage control parties were activated. No casualty lists were compiled. No emergency signals were sent to nearby ships. For a warship in the Pacific, this absence was extraordinary. Comparable Japanese night raids during the same phase of the war routinely produced fires, flooding, and dozens, sometimes hundreds, of casualties. Bombs that struck amidships could cripple propulsion. Hits near magazines could erase an entire crew in seconds. The statistical expectation of survival during a successful night attack was grim, yet this ship remained intact. Morning inspections confirmed it: hull plating unmarked, anti-aircraft mounts untouched, radar antennas still aligned. 800 sailors reported fit for duty. The only physical evidence of the encounter was fatigue, and the plotting board record preserved in the CIC log. That record mattered. Naval warfare depends on pattern recognition. A single escape might be dismissed as chance. Multiple escapes suggested something else. When analysts compared this incident with others in the area, a clear distinction emerged. Ships that maneuvered early before bomb release survived. Ships that waited for visual confirmation did not. The decisive factor was not speed or armor, it was timing. The radar operator's report entered official channels with precise language. It described the two-line plotting method without dramatization, emphasizing geometry rather than intuition. Bearings were listed, time intervals documented, the maneuver angle calculated. This clarity allowed others to test the method, on other ships, in other task groups, under similar conditions. Within weeks, CIC training began to incorporate variations of the same idea. Operators were taught to watch for bearing rate changes, not just approach speed. Plotters were encouraged to compare short vectors rather than extend single lines too far into assumption. No medal was awarded for the night's work. There was no citation read over the loudspeaker. In naval culture, prevention rarely received recognition equal to destruction. But the impact was measurable. Ships employing early radar-based maneuvering reported fewer successful night attacks. Japanese bombers increasingly found empty water where they expected targets. Loss ratios shifted, not dramatically at first but steadily. The enemy adapted slowly. Night attack doctrine remained largely unchanged, built on assumptions formed before American radar matured. Each failed raid reinforced the belief that targets had simply been misjudged, not that the defenders had outthought the attack. Meanwhile, below decks, CIC teams refined their craft. They learned to trust short-term data over long projections, to respect what the plot showed even when instinct hesitated, to speak with confidence when seconds mattered. 800 lives were not saved by luck that night. They were preserved by a method that transformed detection into foresight. And as those lessons spread quietly through the fleet, the aftermath of that single raid expanded beyond one ship, reshaping how the Navy would survive the dark. Naval doctrine rarely changes in a single moment. It shifts through accumulation of reports, comparisons, and outcomes that cannot be ignored. The incident entered that process without ceremony. CIC logs from multiple ships began to show similar language: short vector plots, crossing bearings, early maneuver recommendations issued before visual contact. What had once appeared as individual initiative now emerged as a pattern. Training syllabi adjusted accordingly. Radar operators were no longer taught merely to track contacts, but to anticipate behavior. Plotting emphasized time separation between marks rather than extended course projections. The two-line method, sometimes described differently, sometimes unnamed, became part of standard instruction. This evolution altered the balance of night warfare at sea. Japanese air doctrine, shaped before American radar reached maturity, assumed defenders would react late. Bomb release calculations depended on that delay. When ships began turning earlier quietly without warning, the geometry collapsed. Bombs fell harmlessly astern or wide abeam. The change did not make ships invulnerable. Radar still had limits. Weather still interfered, human error still occurred, but the margin of survival widened. The psychological impact mattered as much as the tactical one. For American crews, confidence in the CIC grew. Sailors came to understand that danger could be defeated before it was seen. Trust in unseen warning became habitual rather than reluctant. For Japanese aircrews, the night became less predictable. Raids that should have succeeded did not. Targets behaved inconsistently. Losses mounted without clear explanation. By late war, Japanese after-action assessments noted increasing difficulty in night attacks against radar-equipped ships. The advantage once held in darkness was eroding. All of this traced back not to a new machine, but to how an existing one was understood. The radar operator who drew those two lines did not invent radar. He did not change ship design. He applied discipline at the exact point where information became action. His contribution was absorbed into the system, as naval contributions often are. Names faded, procedures remained. 800 sailors continued the war. They stood watch on other nights. They faced other threats. Many would never know why they survived that particular raid. History often remembers explosions, not evasions. It records ships sunk more readily than ships saved. Yet beneath that silence lies the truth of modern warfare. Survival increasingly depends on interpretation, on seeing not just what is present, but what is about to happen. That understanding would define naval combat beyond WWII, carrying forward into an era where detection and decision merged inseparably. And with that shift established, only one question remained: what this moment ultimately meant. The night ended without fanfare. The sea remained dark, the sky unbroken, and the ship intact. 800 sailors carried on, unaware that their survival hinged on a pair of pencil lines drawn on a plotting board far below decks. In hindsight, the significance of that moment is clear. Technology had provided the capability to detect the enemy, but it was human judgment that turned detection into preservation. The radar operator did not rely on instinct alone. He relied on discipline, on procedure refined under pressure, and on the courage to act when every second counted. This episode illustrates a fundamental truth about war and perhaps about life itself. Tools, machines, and innovation matter only when coupled with understanding. The radar, precise but silent, gave no warning on its own. The plotting board, inert and unremarkable, offered no protection unless interpreted correctly. It was the mind, the trained, attentive, decisive human mind, that transformed abstraction into action. The two-line plot became more than a technique. It was a quiet triumph of foresight over chaos, of order over unpredictability. Its lessons spread through the Navy, shaping training, doctrine, and the very way warships moved at night. Across the Pacific, what had begun as a simple act of calculation became a life-saving strategy repeated in countless engagements, turning potential catastrophe into survival. In the broader sweep of history, moments like this are often invisible. They do not make headlines, they do not inspire songs or monuments, yet their impact is profound. 800 lives spared by seconds and geometry speak louder than any report of destruction. They remind us that in warfare, in technology, and in human endeavor, the difference between loss and preservation often lies in attention, courage, and the willingness to trust what reason reveals. Even in darkness, the sea remained dark, but for those who knew how to read it, the night had been conquered, not by firepower, not by luck, but by insight. And in that quiet victory, the war and the men who fought it were forever changed.